Hey, this is Ina, in with you in the Fight Pack. And this is the first of a multi-part series on the history of Venezuela. So Venezuela is, of course, a country in Latin America. I believe it is the sixth largest country in Latin America, and it is noted for being rich in natural resources, i.e. oil. And for most of the 20th century, the army would defend the country's oligarchy, the rich barons of industry. And in the early 20th century, a dictator named Juan Gomez, he pretty much sold the oil to foreign companies, and in a sense, the oil was looted by those said companies. Of course, the United States was heavily involved in this. Now, Gomez rules from 1908 to 1935, and he's actually able to, during his tenure in office, to balance the interests of the oil companies on the one hand with that of the local elites on the other. And he's eventually gone from office in 1935, and we have a brief democratic interlude lasting from 1935 through 1948. And this is during this period Venezuela is committed to a roughly liberal type modernism. But it's during that same period the oil companies continue to grow in strength, and there's also the continuing divide between the rich and the poor in Venezuela, this contrast of extreme wealth and extreme poverty. In 1948, Perez Gimenez topples the democratic government and rules the country until 1958. The Gimenez Dictatorship is of course backed by the United States, as almost all dictatorships in Latin America have been, and he embarks on a project of modernization. And this leads to uneven development in the country. There is, of course, increased poverty that is felt by the masses of Venezuelans. And he plunders the resources of the state, and he gets rich in the process. Now, normally capitalists expect this, but he didn't share, as it were, adequately with other members of the political and the military elite. And of course he engages in many fancy building projects, particularly in Caracas, and Gimenez gives more privileges to U.S. corporations, as if they didn't have enough already, than his predecessor, and during the dictatorships he reduced taxes on various foreign companies, and for instance, half of Standard Oil's annual profits were provided by its Venezuelan subsidy from 1950 through 1957, and this amounts to roughly $3.8 billion. And the workers have, of course, low wages during this period. Strikes are illegal, and they're under constant surveillance. And migrants are brought in from Portugal, from Spain, and from Italy, and they're used to help control the workforce. And Gimenez, of course, is seen as a great beacon of democracy and freedom by the United States, and he is awarded the Legion of Merit in 1955. His dictatorship, again, leads to the continuing wealth disparity growth, along with the growth of extraordinary corruption in Venezuela. And as his dictatorship continues along, there are spontaneous protests from the poor, and sometimes they attack the rich. And we also even have the church, which condemns low wages, the lack of worker rights, the lack of the social services, and the church stance is showing that the regime is unstable and it lacks cohesion. And also involved among the protests of the poor of Venezuela is the Venezuelan Communist Party. Now, the continuing polarization of wealth, the continuing corruption of the dictatorship, and the continuing protests from the poor are showing the military, political, and business elites of Venezuela that the Gimenez dictatorship is in fact going much too far, and the business elites and the old parties join forces. And we have two parties essentially that join forces. There's the Democratic Action, which is a roughly social democratic style party, very much a reform party. And we have the Social Christian Party, which is a conservative party. And they join together in a force called the Patriotic Junta. And they agree on a transition to a new government. And they establish contacts with military officials in Venezuela who don't like the dictatorship's greed and embezzlement, and the junta, in fact, encourages military insurrections. However, these insurrections are consequently put down by the dictatorship. Yet the fact that the military is not so loyal to the dictatorship is showing that fissures are breaking out within Venezuelan society, and this leads to further isolation of the dictatorship, increased street protests with more active involvement of the Venezuelan Communist Party, and other military leaders are also emboldened and engage in their own actions. And all of this comes to a head, and by January of 1958, Gimenez flees, and we have a new democracy that takes over. And the army command essentially backs the patriotic junta. In this new democracy, the Democratic Action Party and the Social Christian Party, they pretty much are quarreling over the share of power. And they establish between themselves a pact of punto fijo. And the pact essentially establishes a limited democracy. It pretty much shares power between the two parties themselves. It keeps everyone out. They agree to rotate, every now and then. And they agree, to share the spoils between them. And they keep out the left, especially the Communist Party, which had been very much on the ground and really backing a lot of the protests of the poor that brought down the dictatorship. And furthermore, the left is, of course, outraged at a lot of this because the two parties between them are allowing certain reforms, but they're pretty much they're making sure that the status quo is essentially staying intact, and that the masses of the population are not being empowered in any way. So the left, even though it's divided, remains vibrant into the 1970s, and this new democracy, as it were, has to face a guerrilla movement that is inspired by the Cuban Revolution in the early 60s and into the 70s. However, the guerrilla movement is effectively marginalized and defeated. And the new democracy in Venezuela, they use oil revenues and, to benefit, maybe give some crumbs to the population. But the social structure is essentially left untouched, and they do what they can to buy support from members of the population. Now, this structure will remain in place until 1998, but Venezuela, again, is still marked by the extremes of wealth and poverty. And to give you an example, in 1988, the poverty rate in Venezuela was 38.5%, a very extreme figure. The beginnings of the downfall of this managed democracy and the rise of Hugo Chavez can very much be traced to an event that took place on February 27, 1989, which I'll get into as this series continues. And this is Ina saying, until next time.